A new blueprint calls for a single global internet via regulatory interoperability and oversight. That is a roadmap for one worldwide moderation standard. Our next guest served at the U.S. State Department and runs the Foundation for Freedom Online. He's mapped the pipelines between governments, NGOs, and trust and safety teams across such platforms. Our friend Mike Benz joins us. That manual, that recommendation is pretty scary.
Well, it's funny because the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, which hosted Barack Obama's April 2022 speech on disinformation, greenlighting to all of the international allies and empower regulatory authorities that it was now okay, full steam ahead, to have the government regulate mis and disinformation. It was hosted at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, which itself hosted the Stanford Internet Observatory, which has now been shut down, but was the key lever for censorship of the 2020 presidential election in the United States, as well as for censorship of COVID-19. That was their election integrity partnership and then their virality project initiatives. They had 50 people at Stanford University monitoring the internet for mis, dis, and malinformation, anything that might challenge Joe Biden or the perceived legitimacy of his strange universal mass mail-in ballot loss and then win in the days that followed. I had been trying to break into this conference, the one that Michael Schallenberger posted the receipts about. I believe it was a 2 or 3 day conference that Stanford had last month. I'd been trying to get in for a month or so beforehand, but Stanford has now switched to this private model where you pretty much need to give up your government ID to register, and they don't leave an online footprint like they used to. They used to publish these videos and conferences on their YouTube account, but after all the flack that they caught, they now do this essentially in the shadows with funding from the Knight Foundation, which is a USAID partner to help the State Department and CIA flip elections overseas. They fund the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, which is effectively a joint baby of Michael McFaul, the Obama U.S. ambassador to Russia, and Francis Fukuyama, the architect of NATO expansion from the State Department, the Rand Corporation, MITRE, the Council on Foreign Relations, etc. I want to note a few things about this Stanford Cyber Policy Center, which is one of the major global coordinating nodes for wrangling all of the cats. You can almost think of it the way that a border collie is, if you've ever seen them wrangle sheep so that they all go in the same direction and all head into the same barn. This is sort of what the Stanford Cyber Policy Center does with global regulators, with heft from...
Let me just jump in real quick. Yes, exactly. They help usher in these global thinkers when it comes to, here are ways we can censor the entire population. But not only that, Mike, you've been on this case a long time, and we were recently together in a documentary, God Complex, where we laid out kind of, this is the kind of entity that basically laundered the dirty work of U.S. government work. The U.S. government trying to censor American journalists and American people, American voters, and the way to get around some constitutional blockades for censoring the average member of public for just exercising their free speech is to pretty much launder them through these ivory tower research organizations like the Stanford group here.
Yeah, I predicted this all a year ago. I did a video on my X feed. You can find it if you search for the term shadow diplomacy, where I predicted that Stanford University would coordinate with Europe and Brazil, the in-power government allies there, to wield the sort of government power that they could in-power under the Biden administration. Mark my words, you are going to see an exodus from Tony Blinken's State Department, and they are going to go straight into civil society jobs at Brookings, at the Atlantic Council, at CSIS, at the Council on Foreign Relations, at the Penn Biden Center, at Stanford University. They are all going to get their little perches there, and they're going to take that residual influence, and they're going to be making back-channel deals with NATO, Mexico, with the European Union, with the governments in Brazil, in Australia, and they are going to try to do that Brazil strategy that they were able to successfully do under Brazil, and to make it so that the only platforms that are allowed to have global dominance on social media are the ones who do not allow their political enemies to have a voice. And there will be a constant fight between the Trump administration's diplomatic efforts through the government and the blob's censorship diplomatic efforts in the shadow government. And this maps exactly, by the way, with Norm Eisen's 2025 Democracy Playbook plan. I'm going to, if you recall, at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, plotting all of the government regulators from the Biden-Obama blobs in power governments with the EU, Brazil, and Australia, representatives and deputies from those governments and their digital regulatory offices meeting with Stanford to coordinate a global action plan for government censorship of populist voices. This is exactly what Norm Eisen called for in January 2025 when Trump was coming to power.
Huge Obama ally.
He was the White House ethics czar for Barack Obama, as well as the State Department ambassador for Obama. And what Norm Eisen wrote is that basically federal action is now uncertain because of the Trump administration taking power. But we should move to the state level to consider wielding our considerable regulatory power over tech companies and social media platforms at the U.S. state level, and then also find partners and allied regulators such as the EU, Brazil, and globally in 2025. And who was at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center? Representatives from the EU, Brazil, and globally, such as in Australia. This is
what a
all
coincidence.
moving to the exact playbook. It's the same players, the same playbook. It is incredibly predictable, and it now falls to the White House and the State Department.
This story is so important because it highlights a point that I think you have been making with a steady drumbeat sound out there on the internet. You have been out there saying, look, these players don't just go away. They morph, they change colors, they change shapes, but their core ideas remain the same no matter who buys X, no matter who's in the White House. The very impulse that the left seems to have to censor speech that is contrary to their agenda is always going to be there. So what you're laying out is an entire blueprint for how they just morphed like animals, like different colored animals, into a different form, doing the exact same thing they were doing under Biden and under Obama. And that is ultimately to silence anyone against their agenda.
Well, the motor engine of this is this revolving door. The networks stay together. When they lose an election, they move into the university centers and get paid through these foundations or the various monetary pass-throughs, all the different corporate sponsors. For example, if you go to the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, you'll see that the courtyard is sponsored by Bechtel, one of the major CIA contractors dating back to the 1950s. Of this international energy, weapons, motley crew of Atlantis' foreign policy benefactors who basically take the imprimatur of advancing U.S. interests to advance their own. They hijack American foreign policy for their own personal profit. But this is what happened. I mean, look at Jake Sullivan. He's at Harvard University now. Look at Victoria Nuland. She's at Columbia University now. Look at Hillary Clinton. She's at Columbia University now. Look at Mike Pompeo. He's at Columbia University now. Look at Michael McFaul. He's at Stanford University now. And then they will rotate back into government assistant secretary or secretary of state jobs. This is what Tony Blinken, how he ran the Penn Biden Center for, right, they'll sit on corporate boards. But what's important about the university relationship is that this is a government-funded relationship. The Trump administration right now is currently trying to get universities to sign on to what it's calling the Compact for Higher Education, which is essentially a set of principles around what your university can do before it can qualify for federal funds. These are major, major behemoths. You can think of universities as supersized NGOs. The Harvard University gets $9 billion worth of grants. Grants, not even contracts, just free money to Harvard University.
At that point, they're not non-governmental. At that point, they're government arms.
Chanel, they were never non-governmental. They were always. If you trace back the history of how universities supersized and exploded into the international influence web. It started in the 1950s when they were weaponized as Cold War instruments and got quickly in bed with the State Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, USAID. In fact, I think it was the Deputy Secretary of State under Eisenhower referred to there being no line, not even a blurring of a line between government and academic work. And referred to a intelligence, academia, and philanthropy axis. You can go back to 1951 and see the CIA meeting with the Ford Foundation to try to convince the Ford Foundation to pay universities to do research studies and set up CIA-front institutes to act as shadow diplomats and influence nodes for the CIA.
And this is
my
where
point
they
here
recruit all
is
their movers and shakers.
My point, yes, but the point is Francis Fukuyama was at the State Department Policy Planning Center. That is the synthesizing node between State Department overt action and CIA covert action. Why do they want to control social media? It's to control elections. Barack Obama was a free speech maximalist during the Arab Spring. The only reason they're calling for censorship of social media is because they're losing elections. And elections determine governments, and governments determine markets. And so you need to strip every dollar of federal funding to universities unless they forsake now and forever this role as a shadow diplomat for doing things that are unconstitutional in the United States to coordinate with foreign governments to crack down on the rights of Americans. It's treason, frankly.
And there's the call to action. There it is, right there. If only it were that easy. Mike Benz, keep up the great work. Follow Mike Benz on X for some very deep dives on these topics. It's an important topic to be on top of. Mike, good to see you, as always.
You too.